I guess you all know what flipping a house means. You buy a property, restore it, and sell it for a profit. And I wondered how interesting would it be to do something similar but with an abandoned church instead. Of course, I didn't buy an actual church, if it's even allowed, but I did a little digital experiment. I picked one random image of an abandoned cathedral from the internet, and there's plenty, and I planned a plausible reconstruction. For this experiment, I followed 3 simple rules. Number 1, to use just that one image throughout the entire process. Number 2, to gather no context at all on the actual building, just to avoid any bias and keep my hands as free as possible. And number 3, to keep at least the main overall structure of the building into the final result. What about my goals instead? For sure, to push my imagination a bit, as in general I'm quite used to model around specific references, then to step out of my comfort zone. This was in fact the occasion to try out something different, like digital sculpting, or to simply dust off softwares I haven't used in a while, and of course to have fun. The one caveat is that I can still get inspiration from real places when designing the new cathedral. The image I chose is this one right here. As mentioned, I know nothing about this place except for the fact that it is apparently located in Italy, at least based on the caption of the image itself. The cathedral seems to be organized around a central nave and 2 lateral aisles, and what strikes me immediately is the use of the rounded Roman arch. Pillars are quite thick and short, and their style seems to be outside of the typical classical orders. At the top we can see the remains of a barrel vault with no openings. As such, the only source of light may have come through these little windows at the sides. At the end of the nave, there seems to be another space, but not enough to imagine a proper transept, and there seems to be no apse as well. To sum it up, classical influence is clear, but it seems to be mixed with styles from a later era, with a general sense of robustness coming from the pretty thick pillars and walls in what would have been a quite dark ambient overall. Given that, this place could be a good foundation for either a Paleochristian or Romanesque cathedral, which again may be very far from what the actual building was really about, but in the end, since I had to choose which way to go, this is what I opted for. Based on my third rule, I want to keep the main idea of this building alive, in particular maintaining the central nave and the 2 aisles with their current dimensions, respectively separated by a series of rounded arches mounted on top of thick pillars, like in the original picture. To allow for a bit more light to enter into the structure, I removed the vault and replaced it with a straight wall instead, with windows running along its length. I remodeled the windows at the sides as well, removing also in this case the vaulted ceiling. As for both the nave and the aisles, I'm planning to use in fact a trussed wooden roof. At the end of the nave, I'll place a proper apse exploiting the curvature of this main arch here, which I will keep. Finally, I replaced the current altar with a new one. I used a few references for both the modeling and the texturing processes. Some of them are more on point with the overall style I chose than others, but still the final result should be consistent enough. The very first step in this restoration exercise is to jump into Fspy to work out the perspective of the reference image. This is especially useful to build superimposed reconstructions, but it also serves the purpose of assessing real-life measures and proportions of whatever is depicted in the benchmark image, assuming you know at least the real size of just one of the elements in it. In my case, I'm assuming the pillars to be around 4 meters tall based on the dimension of the pillars I got from one of my references. To exploit this in Blender, just ensure that the add-on is enabled in the preferences, and then we can simply import the Fspy file. From now on, whatever we model, it can be easily placed along the perspective of the benchmark image, and the dimension of the objects will be consistent with whatever you specified in the original file. Whenever I work with Fspy, and before moving on with the other parts of the process, I usually do a little validation just to be sure that I didn't mess up the vanishing point when preparing the file. In fact, if this is the case, it is better to be aware of any inconsistency right away. After the validation, I can begin the reconstruction itself, starting from the central nave and in particular from the series of arches separating the nave from the aisles. Nothing complex here, just half circles placed along the perspective of the benchmark image. If you're wondering why I'm not using an array modifier here, the reason is that either in the original building the arches are not placed exactly at the same distance from one another, or because my Fspy file is, well, a bit biased. No big deal in any case, it is just a bit less comfortable to work with as I need to place each of them manually. Moving on, I'm adding a few additional details to my base meshes, just like the profiles placed along the curvature of each arch, to make them look more interesting. In this phase, I'm trying to include as many elements of the original building as possible into my reconstruction, for it to appear coherent with what is still in place. And when I'm not reusing originals, as it is the case for the imposts of the arcade, I'm taking inspiration here and there from my references. In this particular case, I got inspired by the Cathedral of Monreale in Sicily, Italy, a beautiful combination of styles that well reflects the mix of cultures of that era and place, from Italo-Byzantine to Arab, Moorish and Latin Romanesque. For sure, a good fit for my project. It is with the capitals of the columns, though, that I quite often stepped outside of my comfort zone. In fact, I'm way more used to box modeling than I am to sculpting, but given the style I'm looking for, which is centered around organic shapes, I felt that just moving vertices around with my mouse would not have been enough. So, with a base mesh prepared within Blender, I'm moving to ZBrush to start sculpting, using Dynamesh to slowly build up the overall shape. I could have used Blender also for this part of the process, sure, but when it comes to remeshing tools, either dynamic or not, I'm a bit more comfortable with ZBrush. Moreover, the entire project has also the purpose of using softwares I haven't used in a while, and this is one of them. Once finished with the sculpting part, I would simply export the remeshed object to import it back into Blender. Luckily enough, since I'm planning to use one of my procedural materials to texture it, no further steps such as a proper retopology and/or UV unwrapping is actually needed. Now, Romanesque cathedrals usually host a considerable variety of capitals in different shapes and forms, and as such, for the arcade I'm targeting at least a couple of variations. So I searched through my references once again, and the process is exactly the same. Base mesh in Blender, all the sculpting and remeshing in ZBrush to then export the final result back into Blender. Now here is where the workflow gets interesting. Starting from a piece of geometry, in this case a leaf or more in general an element of a capital, I want to create first the full capital and then from here the full columnate. And I want to do this in the most flexible and optimized possible way. To do so, I would pass my piece of geometry into what I call NDDs, or non-destructive deformers. Essentially, it means that I want to manipulate the original geometry only through lattices, simple deform modifiers, shape keys, and so on. This would be my base instance. I would then use another piece of geometry or a curve within a geonode system to produce the points upon which I want my base instance to be placed. In most of the cases, since the elements of a capital are arranged in a circular fashion, a curved circle is enough. The result of this process would be instead my compounded instance. Again, I would use another piece of geometry or curve to generate new points corresponding to where each column needs to be placed, used as instancing spots for the compounded instance. So essentially I use a nested instances kind of workflow that, along with NDDs placed on the single elements of the composition, allow for the maximum degree of flexibility and efficiency. Note that the compounded instance may as well be, as in this case, its own collection of capitals instead of just a single one, so that in the final geonode system we can display multiple variations all at once. For the series of rosettes below each arch, I followed the same approach. In this case, the starting piece of geometry would be the entire rosette, again with NDDs to manage in particular its curvature. This base instance would then be passed into a geonode system to create the semi-circumference. The compounded instance would then be spawned on new points to get the entire number of iterations based on the overall number of arches. Again, I'm using a collection of rosettes as the base instance to get multiple variations in place. Moving on to the top part of the nave, which is the one replacing the original barrel vault, my intention is to have additional openings to allow for more light to enter into the building. My references here are the Cathedral of Santa Apollinare in Classe for the overall structure and the Cathedral of Jaca for the actual shape of each opening. For the columns of this top part, I use the exact same workflow as for the nave's arcade, both for the creation of the elements of such capitals and for the placement of the columns in space. Here I just fancied a somewhat more elaborated style for the shafts to make the composition look a bit more dynamic. For the trussed roof, I got inspired again by the amazing details and decorations of Monreale. The modeling part is quite straightforward, with beams being placed using an array modifier, while for the sections between each pair of beams I used again a geometry node system. The same process is applied as well to create the roof of the aisles, simply readjusting the respective sizes and dimensions to make each piece fit into the available space. The openings in the aisles are placed in correspondence of each arch of the nave. The different parts of the mesh are eventually connected together, and a bevel modifier is used to tighten the edges of each window while keeping their curvature smooth enough with a subdivision modifier. For the apse, I took inspiration from an actual castle, then converted into a Romanesque abbey called Castillo de Loarre near Huesca, Spain. The mid and bottom sections are modeled on a straight line to make the modeling process easier, to be then curved as intended only at the end through a simple deform modifier. For this part of the cathedral, I'm creating again a few additional custom capitals and shafts to try to enrich the final composition as to depict as much as possible the incredible variety of elements that is usually represented under this particular architectural style. To be entirely honest, I'm reusing at times the same model here and there in different spots, both for the sake of time, since making each of these capitals took me quite a lot of it, and also consider that some of them are actually barely visible in the final render. To complete the main model, we need to have an altar as well. For this, I combined a few different references targeting the different sections of the altar. In particular, I referenced the Cathedral of Santa Maria in Trastevere, Rome, combined with the altars of the cathedrals of Lyon, France, and San Clemente, Rome again. The statues I used come from the pack of Dada Designs, and if you wish to use something like this in your projects as well, you can just look for this pack either in Gumroad or Superhive. To finalize the modeling part, I'm just adding a few props like this wooden confessional. The photo you see, which is the reference I used, has been taken personally by me during a trip to Orvieto, Italy, to visit its outstanding cathedral. For the texturing part, I would leverage heavily on Substance Designer. In particular, here I'm trying to reproduce this central pattern from the Cathedral of San Clemente in Rome. Whenever I approach this kind of patterns, I usually try to define which is the minimum portion of the pattern itself that I need, and that can be then tiled over and over again. In this case, the pattern is built around 3 overlapping circles, where the inner groove, which can be a bit tricky to sort out at the beginning, is essentially coming from thinner circles subtracted from the main shape, where the points where the groove is intersecting are manipulated, again with a subtracting technique, as to create the illusion of the groove moving either above or below the main shape. At this point, the pattern is resized to transform it into a texture that is fully tileable. To place the little mosaic tiles within the groove, I'm using the Scatter on Spline node, which you will see I'll use in many other occasions too, to build the mosaics on the walls. I'm then importing everything into Blender using the different black and white masks produced in Designer to correctly assign the right materials to the right portions of the pattern. For the side patterns, I created in Designer a sort of a general template based on what I already had for the central piece, into which I can feed whatever pattern I wish to simply generate also in this case the different masks that I would then need in Blender. At the end of this process, I ended up with something around a dozen patterns, both for the floor of the nave and for that of the aisles. For the decorations of the wooden trussed roof, I'm referencing the Cathedral of Monreale in Sicily. Here I'm using a couple of things, a pack of alphas, and there are really a ton out there for a relatively small price, and the fairly new Paint Along Path tool in Substance Designer, with which you can easily draw paths on a mesh, or more precisely UVs, painting along with your chosen alpha. The cool thing about this tool is that it's entirely non-destructive, meaning that at every time you can either change the positioning of the path or the alpha itself. In this way, I created multiple variations for both the beams of the roof and the intermediate section. The aim here is not to fully texture the mesh in Painter, but rather to create a set of masks to be then imported into Blender, which is exactly what I did, and the reason is that I still prefer to finalize the material in Blender, indeed either because I want to reuse whatever procedural material I already have created, or simply to avoid having to switch back and forth between different softwares. It's now time to discuss the mosaics on the walls of the cathedral. In fact, I decided to cover basically the entirety of the space, both on the walls of the nave and aisles and of the apse. This choice is driven by the fact that this architectural style often contemplates the presence of beautiful works of art in the form of, indeed, mosaics. A mosaic is essentially a combination of tiles of different colors arranged as to form particular shapes. If we look closely at some specific examples and we try to simplify, we can distinguish two main aspects to it: edges and fill. In fact, shapes are at first defined by carefully placing some of the tiles along the inner and outer edges of that very same shape, with the space which is left being then filled with other tiles of different sizes and shapes. To simulate something along these lines, I leverage on some of the relatively new tools available in Substance Designer. Precisely the Mask to Path, Path to Spline and Scatter on Spline tools. The process is pretty simple. I would start from an alpha or a black and white image in general, then I would pass it into a bevel node to create kind of a grayscale gradient around the extremities of the white part of the image. This would allow me to use a gradient dynamic node in combination with some black and white stripes produced by a tile generator as to isolate the edges of the input image. Now I can simply transform these edges into paths and then into splines. With the Scatter on Splines node, it's now easy to, well, scatter a specific shape along the edges of the input image. While this is fine for the edges, we need to take care of the fill as well. For that, it's enough to blur what we just produced and pass it into a threshold node. By adjusting the parameters, it's quite easy to mask the portions of the image which are empty, which is everything but the edges. And as you can see, the result is not that bad. Moreover, this simple chain of nodes can be used as a sort of template where we can use different alpha images as input, and with a minimum amount of tweaks to the node's parameters, we get fresh new mosaics to be used in our project. Also in this case, I'm simply exporting a series of masks because, again, I prefer to finalize the material directly in Blender, where I just need to play around with the UVs and geometry of the mesh I wish to place these mosaics upon, and that's it. Now, while this is good for simple alphas, what if we want to convert a complex picture or painting into a mosaic? In fact, I gathered a series of images consistent in style with one another that I wish to appear as mosaics on the walls and apse of the cathedral. To create the edge mask, I'm using Photoshop, creating a cutout of the specific part of the picture I want to use. At this point, I'll give it a solid gold color background, which will be used for all of the icons I'm converting into mosaics. I'll convert it into a smart object so that the process is non-destructive, and I'll apply a Find Edges filter to the image. I'll make it black and white, and I'll use a level layer to just isolate the main edges of the picture. From here, I would export the edge mask and the cutout with its background as the albedo. Back into Substance Designer, I can now feed the edge mask into the node tree, just as I did with the alphas, and then the albedo into the color output of the material. Time to adjust a few parameters to get the best possible result, and you can see that I am progressively getting closer in achieving that flowing edges kind of effect that mimics a real mosaic. From Designer, I'm exporting the new albedo, normal, ambient occlusion and color variation maps to be used also for the overall roughness of the material. In Blender, I would then mix a base gold mosaic shader with an additional shader intended to be used with the maps exported from Designer. For the factor used in the Mix Shader node, I would then create an alpha mask again in Photoshop, and I would then adjust the brightness, contrast and saturation of the albedo map in Blender to make the transition look as smooth as possible. This is the result I'm getting at the end of this process. Not perfect by any means, but good enough to make this a viable process to get as many mosaics as possible in a reasonable amount of time. Which is exactly what I'm doing here, creating new icons to populate the walls of the aisle, as well as the wall that would transition the nave into the apse. For the top part of the nave, I'm looking at more complex scenes, again trying to ensure that minimum amount of consistency in the styles used to make the final result look as coherent as possible. The same mosaic technique, either fed with alphas or with pictures, is applied throughout the building to further enhance the visuals of the cathedral. The same palette of colors, gold and blue essentially, is used as well for all of the other components of the cathedral, such as shafts, capitals, arcades, imposts, rosettes, profiles, and so on. For a final result that looks something like this. And that's the end of this digital experiment. I hope you got some new interesting ideas to incorporate into your future projects. So overall, would you say this has been a flip or a flop? Let me know what you think in the comments. Take care and see you next time.